Well, we're in here to talk about Ashfield. And the reason we're talking about Ashfield is because in my reading, I learned about Isaac Backus, James Manning, being sent by the Warren Association of New England. It was down in Rhode Island. That was the first association of Baptists here in New England. And they had what was called a grievance committee that was collecting information and trying to help the churches that were being persecuted in the various towns here in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And so they were sent down to the Continental Congress in 1774, and they had a meeting down there. First they met with the Philadelphia Association. It was started in 1707, which is the foundation for all of the Baptist associations basically in America, and preceded Warren Association and was the basis for that association. They met with those Baptists, great leaders down there, and the mayor of the city and other dignitaries, and then they arranged a meeting of this committee from New England to present their case to the Pennsylvania delegates to the Continental Congress, and since they were from Massachusetts, the Massachusetts delegates like John Adams and John Hancock and so forth attended the meeting, and other delegates from other states also were there. And lo and behold, you read there was a man that was with them by the name of Killiab Smith. And he's from Ashfield, Massachusetts. So I said, I'm going to learn more about Ashfield, Massachusetts. Why was this man with them at the Continental Congress? And should Baptists remember the church at Ashfield? And so, since I was a pastor for almost 30 years at Bible Baptist in Northampton, all I have to do is go up to Yankee Candle at South Deerfield and make a left-hand turn on Route 116, and I can go up to Ashfield, and I can go up there and see if I can find anything that's left of some remnant of the First Baptist Church Ashfield. And so my wife, with her patience, we've made a number of trips over the years, and we found the cemetery up there. And I've collected a few books and so forth. This is a history of Ashfield that I have with me. And this is an interesting book that's been recently written called The Brittle Thread of Life, Backcountry People Make a Place for Themselves in Early America. And let's see, this hasn't been written that long. Let's see, 2009, this was published by Yale University Press, but it has a section on Hunterstown, and that's where you might misunderstand what it is, because that was the first name of Ashfield, and then they changed the name to Ashfield. I've got a map here of the town of Ashfield too, if you want to see that and ask any questions about that. So, the first picture shows you the, oh, and by the way, if you have anything that you want me to check out for you about these things, I give my email address at the end, and I would be happy to send you the Adobe file of this, and you can have this in color on your computer if you would like to have that as well. I printed this in grayscale because it's cheaper. And so forth. But the first thing that you have here is the gate to go into the cemetery, and this actually is called Baptist Corner. This section of Ashfield today is still known as Baptist Corner. And so They're actually, when you drive into the town of Ashfield, you come to this strange intersection where there is this, what I think it was a fountain that eventually was there when the horses came. They could water the horses in this intersection. Now they've moved it out of the middle of the intersection, so it's off to the side but it's still, when you come into the other road that comes into that intersection, if you're not paying attention, you can run into this great big stone fount that's right there. They plant flowers in it now. But at that intersection, there is a sign then for Baptist Corners Road. And so you just take Baptist Corners Road. There's also signs for Gray Sugar House, which is highly recommended for getting pancakes and fresh maple syrup in the spring. And you pass then where Gray Sugar House is out there and go a little further. And then there is a March Road. And you make a left turn on March Road, and up a hill, and the road curves just a little bit, but just a short distance is this cemetery. And in the cemetery, this stone here is the grave of Elder Enos Smith, died at 87. The Smith family is most significant. Kileab was a prominent resident of Hadley, Mass., and he was saved in the Great Awakening of 1740 to 42. He moved his family to Ashfield and started having Bible reading and prayer meetings in his home. This was the origin of the church. His sons, Ebenezer and later Enos, served as the pastors of that church. And Ebenezer moved to Stockton, New York, as did many others from the church, and he died there, so he's not in the cemetery. And I think Kileab's stone is there, but it's no longer legible. I still have not made contact with their historical society up there to figure that out, but that's still something I'll have to work at. But if you're at that cemetery, then right at the gate, if you'll go back and look on the other side of the road where you drove up, there is a big forest of pine trees, and there is a little path that goes back into the woods. Now, the last time I was there, there'd been a lot of storm damage and so forth, so the path was not very good. I hope somebody's gone back up there and cleared it up again. But back in there, just a little ways, you have this monument that's the third picture here. And this says on the monument, site of the First Baptist Church, built about 1775 and removed in 1831. They moved it out of this woods and put it out on the road. Eventually the building became a schoolhouse for a while. But over the years, this church had some 600 persons on the roll. And after the death of Elder Enos Smith, a number of the pastors served a short time, but with many moving to better farmlands in New York and distant parts. In other words, those that had gone out there with Ebenezer wrote back to the people there and said, you know, this farming in Massachusetts is for the business, for the birds. Said, come out here. I'm out here by these lakes and, you know, the Finger Lakes and all that. And they said, you know, this is much better. So many people moved away that it actually left the deterioration of this church, and it was like out in the boonies of Ashfield, and other churches were started. So the church eventually ceased to exist around 1850. But it still had this remarkable history that it was involved in this important meeting with members of the Continental Congress, and they contributed to the understanding of the need for the First Amendment to the United States Constitution that says that Congress shall make no law for the establishment of religion or the preventing of the free exercise thereby. And so also out of this church came a lady by the name of Mary Lyon. And I had never paid any attention to who Mary Lyon was till a few years ago. The United States Post Office put her on a stamp. And she's not really pretty. But she's very important because she believed in women's education and she was used to establish the first college for women. Okay, because of course they couldn't go, the other colleges like Amherst College in the area, that was a men's school. You couldn't go to a Amherst College if you were a woman. And she persuaded important leaders in the Connecticut Valley to back her. She had great help from a man by the name of Edward Hitchcock, who was a great geologist and found a lot of the dinosaur tracks that the Pioneer Valley is known for, and other geological formations and so forth. They're housed at Amherst College, and he became the president of Amherst College, and he was a believer, and he also was a biographer of Mary Lyon, but he'd been a great help to her in getting prominent people behind her and helping her. But at any rate, this is the grave of Aaron Lyon Sr. That would have been her grandfather on her mother's side, and there were many other Lyon. That would have been on the father's side. Because her name is Mary Lyon. Okay, it was her father's side, the grandfather on the father's side. But on her mother's side are Deacon Isaac Shepherd and Jemima Smith as grandparents. Well, Smith, again, just think above you, I've got the Smith graves. This Jemima, her grandmother on the mother's side, was the sister of Ebenezer and Enos Smith, okay, and the daughter of Kileab, who went to the Continental Congress with Isaac Backus and James Manning. So again, that would tell you that she was in a family there that had a great impact of believers in Jesus Christ. These people were serious about being born again, passing that on. She treated these things as very serious, but she did not actually make her public profession until she was 20 years of age. And she did not, when she built her school there in South Hadley, there were no Baptist churches, so she joined the Congregational Church. But, every Sunday, the professors, whatever schools, churches were available there, the students and teachers and so forth all lined up and all walked together with their different classes to whatever church. She didn't compel anybody, but she wanted everybody to go to church. And also there was, the boyfriends and families did not come on Sunday because she wanted people to spend time with God. Okay, she was that kind of woman. And she wanted Sunday to be dedicated. It was the Lord's Day. And so you went to church with whatever faculty member that you wanted to go to, and then you spent the day in your own meditation and quiet things, and and she had prayer meetings all the time that kids, young people that were Christians and wanted to, kind of got into a fellowship with her, and they would have special spiritual times. This was not for the whole campus, but she had chapel every day. And her school was very involved with all kind of young people that went into missionary work and so forth. But we'll leave all that. Anyway, I've got some pictures here about Mary Lyon, and she's not buried here at this cemetery. Her relatives on both her father and her mother's side are buried there. A lot of the shepherd graves there's only a couple stones that you can still see there. But this is her grave that is a very prominent monument at Mount Holyoke College in South Hadley, Massachusetts. And here's a picture of Mary Lyon, like was on the U.S. postage stamp, more or less. And so, continuing on in our outline here, 1745, the first permanent settlement of Huntstown. I said Hunter, well, that's Huntstown. Later, Ashfield. They changed the name in 1765, and 1750, Kileab and Sarah Smith with 8 children settle in Ashfield. In 1753, the beginning of religious meetings in his home. 1754 to 55, danger from enemies. Some evacuate for months at a time, and a stockade is built around Kileab's house, 150 feet square and 15 foot high. So these villages that were out there, this was very important, that these were like the outposts during the French and Indian War, okay, of American history, and they depended on these people to actually protect the valley towns like Deerfield, Northampton, Hatfield, and so forth, Springfield even, because these people were out on the perimeter, and that would be the place to try to stop any attacks from coming in. So these people were all signed up in the colonial militia back then, the men, you know, and they actually would pay to have these stockades built and all this type of thing. 1761, doctrinal growth from separatist congregational to anti-Paedo-Baptist. Well, what I'm talking about is that as these people studied the Bible, they took the Bible at face value. Again, normal hermeneutics. That if the Bible says something, you follow the grammar and the historical context, and you take it at face value. If it's history, it's face value. If it's a parable, you treat it as a parable. If it's poetry, you treat it as poetry. But based on that, they determine we're in a new dispensation, and we're not baptizing infants like the Jews circumcised babies. That's not the reason. You have to be saved, like Acts 18:8 about the Corinthians. Many Corinthians believed and were baptized. Believe and be baptized. So these people settled on those 2 points, that baptism is believer's baptism. A baby cannot believe in Jesus Christ. And so you have to wait till they make their own decision. And certainly you can pray about it. You can influence them as parents and so forth. And certainly a church like this, you're trying to have classes where you're teaching people the Bible, and so that they'll understand who Jesus is and what He's done for them, and invite them to Christ. But you have to believe, then you can be baptized. So you first of all is the proper subject of baptism, and the second thing is the proper mode of baptism. And they said, Romans chapter 6, baptism is supposed to show the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that can only be done by dunking people in the water. You got to dip them in the water and raise them out of the water. And of course, the Congregational Church was the state church, and so this church out there becomes a problem. You see, yes.
Anti-Paedo-Baptist, that's a good thing?
Anti-Paedo-Baptist is the right. See, Paedo-Baptist means baptizing a baby. The Paedo is the baptizing of a baby. So if you're anti-Paedo-Baptist, then you're opposing baptizing babies. That's the term they used back then, anti-Paedo-Baptist. And they organize a Baptist church, and this is in the town history, this is a quote: "We were led to see of baptism that immersion was the mode and believers the subjects, and this we practice." That's Kileab Smith, okay, from the town history. Elder Smith was ordained in 1761 to 68. The Baptist helped settle the congregational minister down in the center of town, where the town is today. The Baptists were taxed and had to help settle the congregational minister, pay his salary, and they were saving up the money to build a meeting house, but the meeting house was not completed until 1771. And in 1768, Kileab Smith said, "This is enough of this." And he petitions the General Court in Boston for the relief of the Baptists and paying taxes for the Congregational Church. Now, at the instigation of proprietor Israel Williams of Hatfield, the General Court passed the Ashfield Law, not recognizing Smith and his group as a Baptist church, but as New Light fanatics, and not entitled to exemption from the taxes as Baptists. So what is this all about? Okay, a New Light fanatic that started with Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, and they preached, you must be born again. And people got saved. They weren't just educated to be Christians and catechized to be Christians. There was a conversion experience, and you needed to be able to testify of when you were saved, to be a member of a New Light church, okay? And they didn't have a mixture in their church of unsaved people that were trying to get right with God and be moral, and they wanted to baptize their babies and take communion and so forth. They said this is wrong. We believed in saved church membership, to be in the membership of the church and entitled to baptism and the Lord's table. You need to be saved. But this Israel Williams, and I give you more information on Israel Williams over on the next page. I call him the nemesis. Colonel Israel Williams lived from 1709 to 1788 in Hatfield, Massachusetts. He was a graduate of Harvard University. He was the most prominent citizen of Hampshire County. That's Springfield, Northampton, Hatfield, that whole area there on the Connecticut River there. And he was a regimental commander, so he was involved with the militia. So the people out in Ashfield that were in the militia, they answered to him in that regard. Then he became a Massachusetts House of Representatives member after 1748. He was the magistrate of Hampshire County Court of Common Pleas. So if the people of Ashfield were unhappy about the way they were treated, they had to come down to Hatfield and appear before Israel Williams to settle their disputes, with the state church and so forth. But there was a problem because he was also in the governor's council, which works there in the state for a number of years. So that he knew the people in Boston. He was a mover and shaker, just believe me. But he was also a proprietor of Ashfield, which meant that he was a land speculator, okay? So that he owned property out in Ashfield. And so he should have recused himself when the people of Ashfield came, okay, to him, but he didn't. And so he was always ruling against the people of Ashfield. They could get no help from Israel Williams. And it was worse yet. He was also the clerk for the proprietors. So all the dealings about the proprietors, many of them were out in the eastern part of the United States, and these people had bought their property, Caliab Smith and the others, from these proprietors, and these people were trying to run the town, but they didn't live in the town, okay? And so this just led to all kinds of difficulties. Then he was, like I said, he's a landowner. He had investments in other new towns. And he was the principal owner of the store Williams and Graves in Hatfield. So let me tell you, when they went back there, some of these people, Caliab Smith made money helping to carve out a road. You didn't drive a wagon up there. Everything went on horseback at this point. There were no roads. They had, chopped down trees and cleared, and there was a Indian path basically back up there. In fact, this book that I had here that starts out the part on Huntstown about when they had a wedding for this Ebenezer Smith, and he married a prominent woman's daughter, and they had the wedding. They went down to Hatfield for the wedding, and one of the fathers, I think the father of the groom, he had his gun on his horse and led the procession, and the father of the bride brought up the rear with his gun, because it was back when they had no idea about Indians and stuff. And that's the way things were. So if they wanted provisions, you went down to Williams' store in Hatfield to get provisions too. And if you had products for sale, you took them down to trade at Williams. I mean, he had this was like a company town, and he had these people over a barrel. Now, again, more about Israel. Israel Williams had a notable family. His father was William Williams of Hatfield in his dates there. His mother was Christian Stoddard Williams. Notice that word Stoddard, okay? That means she was a daughter of Solomon Stoddard. And that is the whole dynasty. He was the preacher in the Connecticut Valley that taught the halfway covenant, which controlled these, the way these congregational churches organized with the state, okay, and dominated people's lives. And he had a great big family, and he actually he married the wife of a widow of a Mather. Okay, the first preacher in Northampton was a brother of Increase Mather. Okay, and he's the one that organized the church in Northampton. And then he died. They had 3 children, and then that wife then married Mather. They had 12 more, so there's 15 children in this. And they either became colonels in the army, of the militia at that time, or they became preachers, or they married preachers. I mean, Stoddard's family controlled everything. One of those daughters, of course, married a guy by the name of Timothy Edwards, who was down in Connecticut, a place called East Windsor Farms, and they had a son by the name of Jonathan Edwards. So he is a cousin of, his nephew is President Jonathan Edwards. And then he had another nephew by the name of William Williams. His father was down in Lebanon, Connecticut, came from this same family, was in Lebanon, Connecticut, and William Williams of Lebanon, Connecticut signed the Declaration of Independence, okay? And then his cousin Ephraim Williams was over Stockbridge, Massachusetts when Jonathan Edwards resigned from Northampton in 1750 because of theological controversy, and they kicked him out. And he went over to Stockbridge while he was under the protection of this Colonel Ephraim Williams over there. And when his estate, when he died, he was the benefactor of Williams College. So Williams College is named, again, that this is, and there are more. Okay, this is only a sampling of the great influence of the Williams family. So, again, Israel opposed the New Light doctrines of Pastor Jonathan Edwards. Historian Patricia J. Tracy reported that when in Northampton, Israel Williams never visited the home of his cousin, Jonathan. Now here I call him his cousin. I'm confused. Up there I think I say is his nephew. I think he's his nephew, and I probably wrote the wrong thing down here. There were few who could claim to have had a greater role in ending the pastorate of the great Jonathan Edwards in Northampton. In fact, wherever Williams had any sway, he urged congregations to adopt Solomon Stoddard's inclusive model of church governance. Jonathan Edwards had come to the point in Northampton that he said, reading his Bible, just like we read the Bible, that if you come to the Lord's table, you need to be saved. I want to hear your testimony before you can take of the Lord's table. That's what he preached near the end of his ministry. I think he published a book in 1748, and this preacher was down in Lebanon, Connecticut, answered for the Williams family, and there was this controversy going on that eventually kicked Jonathan Edwards out of Northampton, and they said, you're not going to tell us that we can't partake of the Lord's table. So that's basically, he came to a Baptist position, if you please. Jonathan Edwards did, and it got him kicked out of Northampton. So the Baptists of Ashfield appreciated Jonathan Edwards. They were in line with his doctrines of the new birth and so forth, and were persuaded the new birth was a prerequisite to the Lord's table. Williams upheld the tradition of infant baptism. The Baptists of Ashfield did not. Williams would not tolerate this. I'm talking about Israel Williams now again. Thus, the battle between the Baptists of Ashfield and Israel Williams and all the influence he could muster in Hampshire County and in Boston. So, this is why there was such persecution. It was an unusual, it was worse than any place else, and that's why they took Caleb Smith with them to the Continental Congress, that they could hear from his own words, his testimony, about the way they were being mistreated. Now, back over on the other page, there I have a quotation there about halfway down. Probably the majority of the inhabitants of the town were Baptists, and they decided to build a meeting house. Thereupon the non-resident proprietors who owned most of the land in the town, people like William Williams and other people over in the Boston area, became alarmed. Baptist control would drive down the value of the land and ruin their speculative hopes. Respectable people would not live in a town where the Baptists had a majority and were consequently taxing for the standing church would be sky high on the congregational minority. Now, that just help you think of how you were thought of back in those days by the who's who of New England. You didn't want to have the Baptists in your town. And they weren't worth anything. And they would drive down the land value. So now a number of Baptists like Isaac Backus and so forth, they worked with people, and John Leland over in Cheshire, which was only really just a few miles further west, but they were far enough out in the boondocks that they didn't have anything to do with the Connecticut Valley, and so they had liberty out there, and the Congregational Church, the state church, left them alone. So, in 1769, the Ashfield Baptists appealed to the Warren Association of Baptists. In 1769, the town levies taxes on the Baptists. The Baptists refused to pay. In 1770, the town constables thereupon sold their land in a deliberate effort to drive them out of town. Drive them out of town. Okay, I mean, this is why this was called egregious. Okay, the General Court made several changes over the years to the legal requirements for the exemptions to religious taxes. These were subject to abuses being unjustly administered in some towns in the Commonwealth, like in Hampshire County under Israel Williams. Under the leadership of Isaac Backus and the Baptists of the Warren Association were ready to join the American Revolution. The Baptists were no longer content to act within the prevailing system, to accept a policy of mere toleration, that you would get exemption by jumping through hoops, and you had to have papers from this one and papers from that one, and you filed forms and so forth, and then you had to worry about whether the town clerk would accept what you filed, and it was just full of red tape, and that was the system of toleration. The Baptists said, no, we want religious liberty as a general principle and as a natural right, and not a denominational privilege. Isaac Backus wrote a memorial that James Manning would read, and Caleb Smith would be witness before a meeting of the delegates of the Continental Congress in Carpenter's Hall, October 14th, 1774. When Caleb of Ashfield refused to pay for the support of a church that he did not attend, his orchards were torn up, and lands belonging to him were sold to pay his tithes. He and his sons resisted bravely, and for 10 years, with frequent trips to the General Court in Boston, fought the injustice of a union between church and state. Their final victory made that quarter of the world a more tolerant place in which to live. And that's from one of the biographies of Mary Lyon, again, who I've already established that she grew up there, and her life was affected by that. I think I didn't read that back there, that Mary Lyon, by her own admission, says in that community, she learned godliness, character, discipline, industry, and determination. The kind of people they were. And as you can see, they disregarded all the work that Caliab Smith had made. And of course, as I get his house, they built this big stockade around it and everything. They had done all this to try to protect the area from the Indians in the French and Indian War. And none of that was, they didn't give the Baptists credit for any of that, but it was all based on theological bias against the Baptists. And the Baptists had worked to create a community and to establish farms and make the land profitable. I mean, they wanted to work and produce things and have a good life for them and their children. Now, what this is an illustration of, then I realized this when I was studying about this, that this situation is a great illustration of what we call poetic justice. And let me just read the first of these passages in Psalms chapter 7 and verses 15 to 17. He made a pit and digged it, and is fallen into the ditch which he made. His mischief shall return upon his own head, and his violent dealing shall come down upon his own pate. I will praise the Lord according to his righteousness, and will sing praise to the name of the Lord Most High. And so a number of places in the Psalms and the Proverbs, there is the warning to the wicked that if you plan to do evil to your neighbor, your enemy, that you're going to suffer for that yourself. This is poetic justice. And I give you classic examples in the Bible: Abimelech and the men of Shechem, Naboth's vineyard, Haman's gallows in the book of Esther. And remember this, Esther 7, 9, and 10, which is right on your sheet. And Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him thereon, his own gallows. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. And so that is a warning to all of us, really. Don't make mischief for somebody else, because it will come back to you. There's a consequence to such action. So the rest of the story down at the bottom of the page, during the American Revolution, Israel Williams, from this great family, with all this power and prestige, this man who's a mover and shaker in western Massachusetts, was caught trying to circumvent the boycott of British goods to obtain merchandise for his store in Hatfield. The Patriots of Hampshire County, that's not talking about the people of Ashfield. They didn't do this. I'm talking about the people of Springfield, the people, or not Springfield, Northampton, and Hatfield and Deerfield and so forth. They went up out of the and they arrested Israel Williams and locked him up in a jail in Northampton in 1777. And I mention here, this grand old gentleman had to live in a jail with a dirt floor and the most humble provisions. And I can tell you where that jail was, because what that jail was the first meeting house that was a very humble square log construction that is at the corner of US 5 and Main Street in Northampton. And there's a big federal courthouse there, and if you go out on the lawn, right at that corner, inside of the iron fence there's a little stone with a plaque on it that tells you this is where the first church stood from 1661. Okay? That, after they built a better church, they still used that building then for the school. Then later by the time of the Revolution, that building was being used for the jail, and it still had a dirt floor. That's the actual place where Israel Williams it says that he was confined for several months and then confined to house arrest in his home in Hatfield. He had a nice home in Hatfield. And they didn't restore his citizenship till 1780. And this brought humiliation and the ruin of his reputation. Poetic justice. This grand old gentleman had to live in, as I've already read, and he finally fell down his basement stairs and died in 1788 at 79 years. Apparently, the servants in his house, they'd been sent home, and he decided he wanted to go down and get something out of his fruit cellar or something, a little preserves or something one evening when he was an old man, and he fell down, and nobody found him until after he was dead. That's the way he died. Now, I want to compare that again, that here was this village with all this problems, and then I studied about Cheshire, Massachusetts, which is just a little bit further west, and I talked about this in the John Leland thing, but the original group is at this monument that's up on a place called Stafford Hill. There's actually a Stafford Hill Road east of downtown Cheshire where the Cheshire Cheese Press monument is for Williams, and he's buried, and the First Baptist Church of Cheshire. Out to the east of that, and you have to go up on Stafford Hill, you find this monument that it was 1777 erected in memory of the pioneer and patriots of New Providence in 1927. And the reason why that's recognizing about the patriots, that there's actually a grave in there of a Joab. I've got his name down here. Joab Stafford. The Stafford Hill's named for him, and he organized the militia there, and they joined the revolution. They went to the Battle of Bennington, and Joab Stafford was wounded, but he lived, and he was one of the leaders of the Baptists, and so his grave is actually a sarcophagus that's inside of this monument up there. The Baptists from Rhode Island began settling the town of Cheshire at New Providence, later Stafford Hill, around 1767. They organized the Baptist Church in August 26, 1769, calling Elder Peter Worden of Warwick, Rhode Island, and Colonel Joab Stafford, whose grave is housed in the monument, led 41 volunteers to the Battle of Bennington in 1777. So that's what the 1777 is all about. There were 3 Baptist meetings held in the town before the Methodists and the Universals erected their building in 1848. Cheshire had no proprietors, insisting they build a congregational church and settle a minister of the standing order. Elder John Leland moved to Cheshire in 1792 from Virginia, where he'd been involved in church and state battles, and he promoted religious freedom in Cheshire, where everybody worshiped God according to the dictates of their own conscience. And so here's this town that was only a few miles from Ashfield in about the same time period. Ashfield had all these problems because of the state church in Connecticut, and particularly Israel Williams being so cantankerous, and they couldn't live together there in peace in Ashfield. But these Baptists moved up from Rhode Island, and they went further out there in the boondocks where nobody knew they were there, and they established a wonderful town and eventually industry, and they sent that big Cheshire cheese down to Thomas Jefferson's inauguration to show that the Baptists up there were worth something, you see. And they were building a society up there, and they were very proud that they were freeborn farmers up there, and they could do their work without any slaves. Okay, if you were at the John Leland thing, they stressed that. They hated slavery. Okay, so in the CRT business that's going on now, I want to tell you that back at the time of the founding of the country, there were white people that hated slavery and thought that Negroes that were in slavery were human beings that had the same natural rights from God that all of us have. And slavery was wrong from day one, okay? And they were never in favor of slavery. And this Leland down there, before he left, he got the Baptists to pass a resolution that they would work to end slavery. They didn't do that, or at least they didn't prevail, and we had to have a civil war to settle that matter. But it is not true to history to blame everybody in America for slavery. It is not true. And Cheshire, Massachusetts, and John Leland, Roger Williams, and all of those are proof positive that people that say those things do not know their history. And so any questions here? Yes?
But just to make a little typo, there is Cheshire, Massachusetts, not Pennsylvania. You're up here by the Stafford.
Oh! Yes, thank you. That's Massachusetts. That got a P instead of an M. Thank you.
And it is there.
Yeah, thank you.
You can Google
thank
it.
you. And there are no signs to tell you that's there. I have books about historic sites in western Massachusetts. Nobody mentions this at all. I only knew this because I read a history up here, and so I thought, well, I'm going to go out there and see if I can find anything. I was hoping I'd find a cemetery or where the church used to be. If it's out there in the woods, I don't know, as I haven't found it. But I did find this monument. There is just a little white plaque as you drive up that road on the left side. I'm coming from Cheshire, and I get out there to Stafford Hill Road, and then I take the road north. The pavement ends, and then you're on gravel road, and you get to what looks like somebody's driveway, and there's this little thing there. My wife says, "You can't go down there. That's a driveway." I said, "There's signs out there. I'm going to go see what's back there." And for the first time, I laid sight on this. And if you're ever down there, it's a great place to go, because if you will park your car and then walk across the grass to that monument and stand in that monument and look out behind you, you can see the grandeur of Mount Greylock. And all you see is forest. Because of the reservation there, the state reservation, you can, and the trees hide any civilization. You want to go back and imagine that you were in past time. You go to that monument and go to the back and look out towards Mount Greylock, and all you can see is trees all the way up that mountain. It's an awesome sight. And this is what greeted these people when they first settled there out of Rhode Island. They wanted more property and lands and stuff, and they brought their principles of freedom from Rhode Island and established Cheshire, Massachusetts. Our time is up, but I hope you learned some things from this, and I hope you'll go check it out sometime and certainly pass it on. I hope you young people will even try to decide to write some papers, maybe for schoolwork or stuff. But I showed the people upstairs a while ago. This is the paper I wrote for my sophomore U.S. history class in 1993. And the title was Roger Williams' Relationship to the Founding and Opening of Rhode Island as a Free Port of Entry to All Peoples, Even the Jews. So write some papers about Baptist history and these great leaders. And if you're in public school, maybe you'll educate some people about the real history of America. You're dismissed.